US Forest Service. Welcome to Johnston Ridge Observatory. My name is Ranger Lucas and I am kind of the triple I here, the International Interpretive Intern, as I'm originally from Kiel in northern Germany. So I really hope you guys can understand me. Once again, welcome to Johnston Ridge Observatory to Mount Saint Helens. In case you haven't seen her, there she is. It's not that mountain over there, that's Mount Adams. It's that mountain over there, the beautiful volcano here in the Cascades. You came all the way up the Highway 504 to see that mountain. I came all the way from Germany to see that mountain because I really, really like volcanoes. The big problem is we don't have any active volcanoes in Germany. We just have beer, schnitzel, sauerkraut, and that racetrack we call Autobahn. So I had to travel a bit to see Mount Saint Helens, but I actually didn't come to Mount Adams, which I already mentioned is over there, or Mount Rainier, or Mount Baker, or Mount Hood, or any other volcano in the Cascades. No, I came to Mount Saint Helens, and we came to Mount Saint Helens. And I think the reason why we're all here today is an eruption back in the year 1980 I'm going to talk about in this presentation. But first of all, let me show you a picture of Mount Saint Helens, how that beautiful mountain was all about before the eruption. That's her. They actually told me it's a female mountain, so that's her. That's Mount Saint Helens, taken in the year 1979, 1 year before the eruption, from Spirit Lake. And isn't she beautiful? Isn't that a well-shaped, iconic mountain? People here in the Pacific Northwest actually had a nickname for Mount Saint Helens. Does anybody of you remember that nickname? Mount Fuji of the United States of America compared to Mount Fuji or Fujisan in Japan. And this area here was pretty popular, and I'd like to show you what happened here before the eruption. And since I am a geographer, I really like maps. So Mount Saint Helens is right here in the middle. Everything to the east of Mount Saint Helens, so the area you can see over there, including Mount Saint Helens, was and still is part of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. So the US Forest Service, the guys were working for. On this side of the mountain, so the area you saw on your way up, was partly owned by the Washington State, but also by the Weyerhaeuser Company. You might have seen on your way up the white signs with the green bannerole saying like planted in 83, 86, whatever. This is all logging area operated by the Weyerhaeuser Company, and they produce timber. And then people came up here for recreational purposes. Have a look over there. And you can see Spirit Lake, or let's say 5% of the surface of Spirit Lake. And this lake was pretty popular for people for recreational purposes. They came up here fishing the lake, boating the lake, hanging out on the weekends with their friends. And they probably spent the night at one of the several campsites, cabins, or lodges. And one of these lodges belonged to Harry Truman. That's not the president, by the way. That's a different Harry Truman, and I'm going to talk about him a little later. But I'd like you to keep in mind that this area here at Mount Saint Helens, and also the area around the mountain itself, have always been a big interest for the people here in the Pacific Northwest. And that interest became even higher and also international on March 20th, 1980. I'm taking you guys now on a time travel, and we go all the way back to 1980. And at this point, I need 2 volunteers from the audience to help me. You just have to hold this rope for me. Any volunteers? Anyone would like to help me? Yes. Maybe one does it too. What's your name? Joanne. Joanne, nice to meet you. Joanne, I'll give you this end of the rope. Believe me, it's the better end. And this is supposed to be a timeline, and I'm going to show you what happened here to Mount Saint Helens in the 60 days before the eruption. Our story starts right here on March 20th, and you can see red and green markers. Everything which is red marks volcanic activity, anything which is green marks agency activities, so what the government did, what the US Forest did, and so on. So we are here, and you can see the first red marker, which indicates an earthquake with a magnitude 4.2 happening here on March 20th at Mount Saint Helens. The big problem actually was there was only one seismometer all the way on the west flank of the mountain, but you need at least 3 seismometers to clearly locate an earthquake. So it took the geologists a little while to identify and to locate that earthquake. It was a bit faster for the Spirit Lake Visitor Center director. He was down in the valley and he noticed that earthquake, and he immediately called 2 geologists in Denver, Colorado. Their names were Don Molinillo and Rocky Crandall. And those 2 geologists published a paper in 1978, 2 years before the eruption, and they predicted an earthquake of Mount Saint Helens to be happening within the next 100 years, probably before the next millennia, so 22 years from then. Well, it didn't take her 100 years to erupt, it didn't take her 22 years to erupt, it just took her 2 years. So we are right here, first earthquake. The guy down at the Spirit Lake Visitor Center called Don Molinillo. He arrived 5 days later. The very same day, Mount Saint Helens was closed for public access above timberland. On March 26th, the first roadblocks were installed. So the highway you came up, Highway 504, was closed for public access. Nobody was allowed to go back into the Mount Saint Helens area. March 27th, the Emergency Communication Center was installed. The very same day, Mount Saint Helens decided to erupt the very first time after 123 years of doing nothing with a little steam and ash eruption right through the summit of Mount Saint Helens. But this was actually the point when geologists knew Mount Saint Helens is going to prepare for a big one. And she did. The next 3.5 weeks, we had a couple of steam and ash eruptions every day, a couple of earthquakes every day here at Mount Saint Helens. And the big problem at this time was the people here in the Pacific Northwest, the government, the geologists, everybody had no idea what to do. There was no evacuation plan, no emergency plan, no playbook for the imminent eruption of Mount Saint Helens. They actually changed the position of the roadblocks several times because they had no better idea what to do. And also, Governor Dixie Lee Ray declared the state of emergency for the state of Washington in the beginning of April. But then the activity ceased on April 21st. Well, that's not entirely true because there was something happening to Mount Saint Helens. I'm going to show you on the next 2 pictures. I have to put that right here. You can hold on, but I have to show 2 pictures now. This one right here, this first picture was taken 1979 from Timberland parking lot. That was the very last parking lot on the Highway 504 where people started to climb and summit Mount Saint Helens. This was taken 1979, and now have a look what happened to Mount Saint Helens. Have a look on the green dot. What happened? Oh yeah, the bulge. Somebody wrote it on the back of the prop the other day. It's the bulge coming out of the mountain. And the bulge rose out of the mountain with the speed of 5 feet per day. Exactly from here to there. This is 5 feet. And this came out of the mountain every day. Oh yeah, of course. Thank you very much. This bulge was considered to be dangerous, and I'm telling you what. We are standing on Johnston Ridge, not for any reason, because this right here is Dr. David Alexander Johnston. He was a gas monitoring specialist working for the U.S. Geological Survey, and he was unfortunately killed during the eruption. He was on this very ridge. We renamed, in honor of his work and his person, we renamed the ridge from Coldwater 2 to Johnston Ridge. And he stood on this ridge, he was killed. But before that, he said, the bulge is dangerous until it stabilizes. And the only way it can stabilize is to come down. Problem, it didn't. It rose up to 450 feet by May 18th, 1980, out of the mountain. And because that bulge was so dangerous, the government decided to close down the area around Mount Saint Helens with the radius of 10 miles for everyone, and also installed red and blue zones for certain people. So for example, warehouse and company workers were not allowed to go back into that radius. Property owners were still allowed, but nobody was allowed to go back into the red or into the blue zone. This actually was a problem. We come to this back later again. Then, on May 7th, the mountain woke up again and showed some steam and ash eruptions and some earthquake activity, all the way to May 16th. But you can see, nothing major happened to Mount Saint Helens in those 60 days before the eruption. And still, the property owners were not allowed to go back to their property. The people who wanted to go back to Spirit Lake for recreational purposes were not allowed to go back to Spirit Lake. The warehouse company workers were not allowed to go back to their work sites. And nothing major happened to Mount Saint Helens. What do you think? Of course, people tried to sneak in. They wanted to see the eruption firsthand. So they tried to find a way to get as close as possible to the volcano. Actually, we had tour guides around here, sending the people around the roadblocks to send them as close as possible to the volcano. We had over 4,000 miles of logging roads in this area. We, as the Forest Service, had no chance to check them off, but people tried to sneak in. Also, the property owners were really angry. They wanted to go back and check on their property, so the government decided to let them back in on May 17th, one day before the eruption. With an escorted visit, those people were allowed to check on their property and retrieve things out of their property. There was another visit planned on May 18th, but we all know that didn't happen because on May 18th, 1980, 8:32 in the morning, that beautiful mountain over there decided to erupt. I'm going to talk about this next. First of all, thank you very much for helping me, for your substitution. What's your name?
William.
Oh, William. Nice. Thank you very much, Joanne. Thank you very much. Give them a big round of applause. Come on. Yeah, thank you very much. Good. So our story is now right here on May 18th, 1980, and you can see 5 red markers. And I'm going to introduce to you the 5 mechanisms of destruction Mount Saint Helens showed us here on May 18th, 1980. 8:32 in the morning. It was a beautiful sunny Sunday morning, like today, but like being on Broadway for a big performance. This picture right here. You didn't see that? This picture right here was taken by Gary Rosenquist. Gary Rosenquist was about 11 miles away from here at Bear Meadows over there. And he took this picture 8:27, 5 minutes before the actual eruption, because he saw a little bit of steam coming out of the top of Mount Saint Helens. Then he took down his camera, went back to his trailer, and 5 minutes later, he eyewitnessed this. What happened to Mount Saint Helens? What's our first mechanism of destruction? The landslide, of course. The landslide. And this is actually not only a landslide, this is the biggest landslide in recorded human history. This mountain over there fell apart and lost over 1,300 feet of its top. Let's do a little experiment. Please face Mount Saint Helens, close one eye, and take your left pointy and your right pointy, and try to rebuild the summit, the actual peak of Mount Saint Helens, by making some kind of triangle shape with your fingers. And you can see how high Mount Saint Helens was before the eruption. And everything what you're not able to see anymore actually came down in that big landslide in 3 big slide blocks. The first slide block is right here, this section right here. And this came down, crashed into this ridge, and partly went into Spirit Lake. The water inside Spirit Lake was forced up against the opposite ridge, about 800 feet high, came back, settled on 300 feet of rubble, and today Spirit Lake is actually 200 feet higher than it was back in the year 1980. It also doubled its surface, halved its depth, and killed Harry Truman and devastated his lodge. His body and his lodge was never found. He's still there with his mountain, with his lake, and with his wife. She died a couple of days before the eruption. A couple of years before the eruption. The first slide block, as I said, partly went into the lake. Most of it was forced down the valley. This first section roughly stopped at the Castle Lake viewpoint, about 8 miles away from the crater. The second slide block is this section right here. Also crashed into this ridge, was forced down the valley, plowed its way through the first slide block, and roughly stopped at the Forest Learning Center, 11 miles away from the volcano. The third slide block is still attached to the mountain on this picture, also crashed into this ridge with an additional energy with the lateral blast. We come to this in a second. Also went down the valley over the first and second slide block and roughly stopped where that long bridge is you came up, Hofstad Creek Bridge. And this is 14 miles away from the volcano. And this landslide, those slide blocks, left behind what we call little hummocks. Those are, geologically speaking, intact pieces of the original peak of Mount Saint Helens. And you can find them in the valley, behind Spirit Lake, and on the ridge behind me. Let's do a second experiment. Have a look to the ridge behind me, and you can see 2 light grayish mounds. You see them?
Yeah.
Those are 2 hummocks. Those are 2 intact pieces of Mount Saint Helens. And now comes the fun part. I can actually tell you exactly where those 2 hummocks come from. Have a look inside the crater and go to the left-hand side of the inner crater wall. You see that light grayish area?
Yeah.
This is exactly where those 2 hummocks come from. They traveled over 7 miles through the valley, were pushed up by the lateral blast over the ridge, surged over the ridge and settled on top of Harry's Ridge over there. And what we just did with 2 hummocks, this guy right here did it with 675. This is Harry Glicken. He was a graduate student of David Johnston. They were really good friends and really good colleagues. And he he dedicated his doctoral dissertation by researching 675 of those hummocks in the valley behind Spirit Lake over there, and he literally put together the mountain again like a jigsaw puzzle. And he dedicated his dissertation to David Johnston. That was the first mechanism. The second mechanism, I already mentioned it, was the lateral blast. After the landslide, the mountain was open and there was lots and lots of gas and pressure releasing, coming out of the mountain. Well, folks, there is a good way to show you how lateral blast works. This has actually been sitting here for 10 years, I think. But imagine you have a well-shaken bottle of cola in your hand and you open the lid. You have the landslide in your hand. Everything which is inside the bottle, the gas, the pressure would like to come out. There is only one exit, right through the top of the bottle. Same happened with Mount Saint Helens, beside the fact that the actual explosion, the actual blast, went sideways. With the speed of almost 700 miles an hour, this blast obliterated everything which was in between the mountain, this point right here, with an additional 3 miles in north-northwest direction. Every tree of the old-grown forest became part of the blast. And then the blast had so much energy that every tree of the old-grown forest was knocked over. If you go inside the observatory, you can see hundreds of years old Douglas fir, which has just knocked over, which is like a toothpick. Every tree faced away Mount Saint Helens, still facing away Mount Saint Helens. If you go down to the parking lot, have a look to the opposite direction, you can see those trees facing away the mountain. It looks a little bit like you went with a cam over the landscape, right? And even 17 miles away from the mountain, the blast had so much energy that every tree was burnt, not bent over, just burnt. And those trees are still there, and we call it the forest of the standing dead. And to make it even more intense, I have this satellite picture right here. It's an infrared picture which was taken in the year 1979, 1 year before the eruption. It shows you the vegetation. It's the red stuff. It's an infrared picture. And the white spot in the middle is Mount Saint Helens. And now tell me what happened during the lateral blast. The lateral blast destroyed an area of the size of the city of Chicago, roughly 230 square miles, in just 3 minutes. And if you want to know why so many people died on that very day, we had 57 fatalities. Have a look on the red and blue zones again, those restricted zones I mentioned earlier. This is the blue zone, this is the red zone, there is Mount Saint Helens, and that's the expansion of the lateral blast. This gray zone right here. So 50 of the 57 fatalities were actually outside the red and blue zones. It was a beautiful sunny Sunday morning. They hiked, they camped, they had no idea what happened. We come to the third mechanism of destruction, which is the ash cloud. 520 million tons of ash came out of the mountain, rose into the atmosphere, 15 miles in 15 minutes. And if you want to know what that is right there, that little stick is over there, that's not a second volcano, that's Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake was literally boiling from the hot material which went into the lake. The ash rose all the way into the atmosphere and then went to the east. Has any one of you been to Yakima, Washington? Nice pretty town about 80 miles away as the crow flies this direction. I have a little picture from Yakima, Washington. Only problem, this is May 18th, 1980 at noontime, 12 p.m. Day became night in eastern Washington, Idaho, and Montana, and the evergreen state turned gray. The ash traveled even further, all the way to the east coast of the United States, reached the east coast after just 2 days, and after 2 weeks, the ash came back to its origin. It had encircled the globe. Everything, all the material which was inside the mountain, which was pretty gas-rich and very hot, which came to the surface, to the opening of the crater, fell down again, it was pretty heavy, and came through that channelized opening of the crater. It looked a little bit like oatmeal boiling over. It is our fourth mechanism of destruction, and it's called Pyroclastic Flow. Some of the people might recall that from the Mount Vesuvius eruption 79 AD and the destruction of the city of Pompeii. Same happened there, only 3 times bigger. Here we had also pyroclastic flows coming down of the mountain, and the depositing pumice in front of us in the pumice plain. Very light, very intense material. And mechanism number 5 has to do with all the glaciers we had here on the mountain. 70% of those glaciers melted away immediately during the eruption. The water went down into the valley, carried away mud, ash, rocks, stones, plants, everything went down into the valley and created a huge mud flow. And to give you an idea what I mean with huge, have a look on this guy right here. It's a 6 foot tall guy right above my pointy. You see that? And this is where the mud flow ended right there. And this mud flow went down into the valley, for example, to the Weyerhaeuser Company work sites, destroying the work sites, carrying away the crew buses. Then the mud flow went into the town of Tootle, destroying 200 homes. Then it went into the I-5 corridor, destroying 27 bridges. And then it went into the Columbia River and caused the depth of the Columbia River to sink from 39 to 13 feet. It took years to get ships back on the Columbia River. Yeah. Folks, why are we here today? Is it just because of Mount Saint Helens? Is it just because of an eruption back in the year 1980? I think we're here because we are fascinated by Mount Saint Helens. But we are not only fascinated by Mount Saint Helens, we are also fascinated by the power and the strength of nature, the beauty and the calm of the landscape, and the silent and the unpredictability of a mountain. But I even go one step further. I also say we are also fascinated by the 5 mechanisms of destruction Mount Saint Helens showed us here. The landslide, the lateral blast, the ash column, the pyroclastic flows, and lastly, the mud flows. Then we are also fascinated by the science which is done here in this field. Beside the fact that we had 57 fatalities and an area of the size of the city of Chicago which was destroyed, this eruption actually had some kind of a silver lining. Mount Saint Helens became one of the biggest research areas in North America. This is probably one of the best known volcanoes in the world, but for sure one of the best monitored. We will know when this mountain is going to erupt because we're standing in a living laboratory and scientists try to understand how our home, our planet Earth, works with this volcano in our backyard. And lastly, we are fascinated by the hazards coming from Mount Saint Helens. Do you remember those guys trying to sneak in to get as close as possible to the volcano? Don't do this, please. When we closed down Johnston Ridge Observatory, this is for a specific reason. And if you see us in the pickle suits running down to the parking lot, follow us immediately, okay? Just kidding, nothing will happen. But we are also fascinated by the hazards coming from Mount Saint Helens. And I'd like you to remember the initials of that beautiful volcano, the Cascades in our backyard and here in North America. And our fascination with the mechanisms of destruction, our fascination through science, and our fascination through hazards. And with these words, I'd like to thank you for coming up to Johnston Ridge Observatory today, purchasing your wristbands, giving us the fees. 90% of our budget actually comes back to us to maintain and operate this place, giving me from Germany a lifetime experience and you guys a functioning bathroom. So, vielen Dank, dass ich hier sein darf. Auf Wiedersehen, tschüss and goodbye. Thank you very much.